Yeah. All right, it's time for us to start. Now, there are some new things here at the church building. If you would appreciate hearing assist, we have devices that you can hold a little doodad in your lap and an earbud in your ear. Soon to come, we'll probably have the ear muff affair if we can get those in. But anyway, the hearing assist is available. We probably ran short of some of the distributions today. I think Willie's going to make a few more copies back there, but we are in the book of Revelation. Got to thinking about this. I've been thinking too much about it, about to wear out my brain. But anyway, Cody has the class on Wednesday night regarding the minor prophets. And the book will oftentimes start off with, during the days of Ahaz, Hezekiah, and Jeroboam, so-and-so received a revelation from God. The book of Revelation in the New Testament doesn't start that way. And it would have helped us if it had started that way to eliminate half the commentaries in my library. Because people want to argue about the date of the book. Frankly, a lot of times I personally do not focus a lot on the very date that people suppose Paul wrote a letter, though it is helpful at times. You hear things like the early Galatian theory and the late Galatian theory and all that stuff. But this book does have some things that come out later, especially, that relate to who was a ruler in the Roman Empire. Now, we already noted in the book of Luke where Tiberius was a ruler during the lifetime of Jesus. And we've had a chart up here that lists some of those, the bulk of the emperors. Now, I do not have Julius Caesar on there because he was not considered an emperor at the time. I believe he was made a dictator for life, and they clipped his life short by killing him in the Senate. So that was the end of his little reign. But it's an interesting period of history to read, very helpful for folks to study even yet, as how empires work and how republics, democracy, and all that's come into play. So Willie has been handing out a amplified sheet. The graphics are not all that great on it, but anyway, it has a little more detail about each of those emperors. Some of their behaviors are depicted on those sheets. The purpose of that, in this book of Revelation, we'll find people being killed, martyrs, because of the faith they hold in Jesus. And persecutions are mentioned that will be coming down on Christians. So when we look at these sheets pertaining to emperors, some of them had nothing to do with Christianity, hardly at all. But another one will take note of those Christians, and at times they'll include the Jews. May I say at this juncture, when the church first started, it was composed of which? Jew or Gentile? Jew. Gospel went first to the Jew and then to the Greek Gentiles. All right, so Peggy, is that you out there? She's still here. I thought she was going to be a goner. Okay. Well, anyway. Make sure she hears. Well, I'm going to talk to her personally. Okay. Thank you, Willie. Now, in the book of Revelation, we got running last time. I'm afraid that we do not read enough from the book each time. But in chapter 4, we saw a symbolic depiction of the throne in heaven. We had seen a depiction in chapter 1. In chapters 2 and 3, we have seen Jesus among the churches. So the book starts off not talking about emperors, Caesars, it's talking about who's really in power. And this is written for the comfort of the churches, because we do not see spirit, God is spirit, we do not see the throne with our physical eyes. So John was given this revelation where he could see these figures of things that are up there and see action that occurred. It's fascinating in a sense that in our time there's a lot of interest in fantasy, and sometimes I think people can relate a little bit more to these fanciful figures in the book of Revelation, really using Old Testament expressions to symbolize things that are up there. So it takes a little bit of an acquaintance with the Old Testament to even follow along with what the book of Revelation is talking about. Some commentators think that this form of apocalyptic language was used so that enemies of the church could not get their hands on a copy and see them named and come down on the church for putting out literature that some of those nearly paranoid rulers would get upset about and come and kill Christians. So that's a thought that might pitch out there for you. So in chapter 5, we saw a book sealed with 7 seals. It was in the right hand of the one on the throne. There was no one worthy to open the book to see what was written except the Lamb standing, though it looked like it had been slain. And that Lamb, of course, we know as Jesus Christ, who died for us, but he was raised from the dead, and he's reigning up there. So the Lamb of God is still there. We've seen in the book already Jesus depicted with glorified symbols, and his eyes are like what? Flames. So in earthly jargon, fire will get rid of all the gross stuff and get right down into the heart of things. So there's a lot of symbolism in those expressions. You don't trick Jesus at all. God knows what's going on down here, and these who are ministering to the throne up there also are depicted at times as having eyes everywhere, eyes. And so the messengers that God sends out have eyes, not just forward. I said to one of the sisters back here earlier, oh, I don't have a backup camera on me. I almost backed up into you. I don't have eyes in the back of my head. But these entities see everything. When the judgment day comes, will heaven know what we've been up to? Every secret thing. Uh-oh. We don't get away with things. Oh, I have to be careful. I'll start preaching. Number next. So that was chapter 5. Chapter 6, the opening of the seals. We read there last time a bit. Jesus opens the six seals, chapter 6. He starts in on the seven seals, but I believe it goes through 6 of them, down in chapter 6, verse 12 of Revelation. I saw when he opened the 6th seal. Then there's a pause that occurs in chapter 7. Now, if you are with me and have your Bibles open, you must have them open in this class. What is going on in chapter 7? You have a header, or can you figure that out quickly? The tribes, for what purpose are they named? What's happening to them? They are being sealed. So, a seal indicates ownership, right? The signet ring, for example, on the seal indicates ownership. So, in the break from chapter 6, before we get to chapter 8, chapter 6 is depicting these judgment scenes coming down, but there are people who are sealed as God's people. They are marked. He owns these people. So that gives comfort to the Christian. Even though these punishments come down, God knows where you are. God knows what you're enduring. You're His, all of you are His people. And if I might use a figure from the Old Testament, those who would tamper with God's people touch the apple of His eye. How sensitive is the center of your eye? Yeah, you don't mess with that. If anything even comes toward your eye, what's your eye do? Blink. And you don't even have to think about it. That's a sensitive part, and it's protected. So that's the figure. God knows His people. So He has not forgotten us down here and what we're going through. A bit of comfort. So anyway, you have those little charts with more indication of how the rulers behaved. Some of the images of their heads are found on old coins. But on my chart that we were looking at earlier, the two rulers that most of the commentaries focus upon are Nero and Domitian. So Nero is in the middle of that chart. I believe 54 to 68 AD. And when was Jerusalem destroyed? 70, all right? So after Nero Caesar, the other two after him, Vespasian and Titus. Vespasian was one of the military men. He was after the city of Jerusalem, and his son Titus was also over there. And when Vespasian took over as the ruler, emperor, his son Titus continued the job. Then we come over to the one Domitian. We'll probably talk a lot about him because he is between 81 and 96, roughly on my chart, in power. And so there's a supposition that the book of Revelation was written in the period of Domitian. And there are others who think, well, this book uses an awful lot of language we find in Matthew 24 pertaining to the destruction of Jerusalem. And us, it makes sense that you can't have Jesus foretelling the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew chapter 24 in the early part and not have the completion of the job unless it's in the book of Revelation. And so the language from Matthew 24 we find in Revelation must mean, hey, Christians, you start focusing on the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's what it's pertaining to. But there are big problems. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not all that excited about talking about dates, but There are controversies about that and how to apply the words that we find in the book of Revelation. Does it pertain to this or that? Whenever folks try to figure out the date a book was written, there are two big categories that the scholars go to, called external evidence, and then later they'll talk about internal. So the internal would be things in the book itself that give a clue. External would be things outside of the book that give us a clue about its date. Now, one of the biggies on this, I hope you don't mind my expressions, but one of the biggies on this was a man named Irenaeus, who very early had something to say about the book. Now, if I were to peg roughly the time he said this is roughly 180 AD, all right? So he's way, way back in history from our standpoint. This man knew a Christian named Polycarp who lived at Smyrna. Polycarp was martyred, early Christian martyr, around 155 AD. So Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. Who wrote the book of Revelation? John. So people who read these old writings of people like Irenaeus take note. Irenaeus wrote that the revelation was seen not very long ago, almost in our own generation, at the close of the reign of Domitian. But the critics that they are, will even criticize the statement of Mr. Irenaeus. But I'll get to that in a second. So this very early external witness, so to speak, or evidence was Irenaeus. Since Caesar Domitian died in 96 AD, this then supposes that the book of Revelation had to be written perhaps toward the end of that man's power. Especially, folks will note on your chart the behavior of Domitian. He was known as a persecutor of Christians. So that comes into play because this book talks about that sort of thing and what Christians would be enduring. And so we read the verse that preachers use quite a lot from Revelation chapter 2. Be faithful unto death, and you will receive the crown, and so forth. And so the Amplifying Version will say, be faithful even in the face of death, and you will receive the crown. So the connection is made that way. Some other scholars, though, will criticize the comment from Irenaeus. You all have studied languages, haven't you? Yes. So you have first, second, third person singular, first, second, third person plural. All right, so when you come down to first, to be I, you, third person singular, what is the pronoun in front of the third person singular? He, she, it. The context determines which you will put in he, she, or it. And so some of the critics of Irenaeus will say, well, the Greek could be translated not it was seen, but John was seen, he. And get rid of the whole argument from Irenaeus' testimony. So that's what they do. I told you this gets tedious. And I do not like getting bogged down on this, but you need to be aware of some of the matters that pertain to it. There are some other things I'll go by quickly. Old translation called Syriac, Aramaic translation, but that was out in the 3rd century to the 7th century, roughly. It titles the Apocalypse with a header saying John was banished by Nero. So that throws a monkey wrench into it. But here's one I would put more stock in if you're going to go out into the 3rd century, Victorinus. He's the author of the earliest existing commentary on the book of Revelation. Now, if you're going to write a book pertaining to Revelation. You're going to do a lot of studying, aren't you? And this man says in the writings, when John said these things, he was in the Isle of Patmos. Correct? He's correct there, isn't he? Condemned to the mines by Caesar Domitian, the one in the 90s that we're talking about, AD. There he saw the apocalypse, that's the revelation, and when at length grown old, he thought that he should receive his release by suffering, in other words, die. But Domitian being dead, he was liberated. And Domitian was a rascal, I'll be brief, and he even banished the wife of a man he murdered to an island. So he was known for that conduct, exiling people. Almost done with this, I hope. After 70 AD, the population of Christians increased in Asia Minor. Why we mention Asia Minor? To the 7 churches of Asia, all right? So there are more Christians in Asia Minor, the region we call Turkey these days. That's the place the letters were written to, but Domitian persecuted believers in that region. Since Antipas is mentioned in the book of Revelation, who already died for the faith, that's Revelation 2, verse 13. This lends weight to the later date. But in Nero's reign, the man back in 60s, 64 roughly, the refusal of Christians to participate in emperor worship was not the problem that Caesar addressed. When Nero troubled people, Jew or Christian, he needed a scapegoat for the burning of Rome. And so he accused them. And that's the reason they were tormented or persecuted. But Asia was not involved in that. That was a matter around Rome. The believers were blamed for the fires. Now, Tacitus Annals, this is a pagan historian. He brings all that out in detail. And so that's the reason the scholars bring up things like this. So we find no convincing evidence in history that Nero persecuted believers in faraway Asia. During Domitian's reign, the one we're inclined to think wrote, the book was written in his reign, emperor worship was required of subjects. Rome tried exterminating Christianity on the ground that it was a society guilty of high treason to the state. And this philosophy came about under Domitian first. This is in the International Critical Commentary. Several predecessors of Domitian embraced the concept of emperor worship, but Domitian is the one who treated it seriously and persecuted people over the matter. Domitian issued a formal pronouncement for it. Now, this man Domitian, I don't know if you still have your notes of those pictures, he embraced the concept of emperor worship. He treated it seriously. And his follower, Trajan, also issued formal pronouncements for it. But Domitian killed a relative, Flavius Clemens. He was known for oppressing people in Rome, nobles and so forth. He banished his wife, Domitilla, for sacrilege, which in the original was for atheism. Christians were considered atheists. Why would they be considered atheists? They didn't believe in the gods. They were not going to worship all those pagan idols. And so they were the ones who were branded atheists. So it's thought that she had Christian beliefs, the one he banished. Oh well, Caesar built a temple for himself at Ephesus in that era. Then the one last one of any note, I'll try to get off this pretty quick on the external things. There was something that occurred whenever Nero expired. He was not liked in Rome, and he took off out of the area, committed suicide, assisted suicide. The people of Rome were so fearful that character was going to come back that there was a rumor that's written in history that the people feared that he did not really die, but he went over and got the people from Iran and Iraq, Parthians, and going to bring those people back and take power. And so this was an expression about Nero revived. Now that pertains to the book of Revelation because there's a king, a ruler that appears that was dead, that came back alive. And people think that is an allusion to Nero in this book. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but we'll have to mention some of that later when we get to the text. So the church conditions, so forth, all fit pretty well. One last one on the external. Paul is said to have written a book to Ephesus. And Jesus wrote a letter to the church at Ephesus. One of the negatives there in this book of Revelation, it says, you have left your first love. The guys who keep up with the dates when Smyrna was founded, supposedly around 64 AD, think about that. If the book of Revelation was written just a few years later, say 65 to 8, that church went downhill awful fast. And Paul sent Timothy to Ephesus. 1 Timothy 1, verse 3. He mentions Timothy working there also in 2 Timothy. And 2 Timothy was written about 67 AD, we think. So there's a problem with that early date and the decline of the church at Ephesus, where Jesus said, you've left your first love, seemingly lickety-split, while Timothy was working over there. So that puts then the pressure on the preterist. This, you can't be right. It has to be the passing of time. So by the 90s, sure, that church could have gone downhill. That's the external stuff. Now, this is wearing you out. We can abandon this, but I think there's something we need to get out of our crawl before we go forward. Now let's look at the internal things. John addressed churches. He did not address the household of Israel when he wrote these letters, or Jesus wrote the little letters to the church at Ephesus, Asia. All those were churches. John's address really is going to churches. And that's a slight distinction to keep in mind. In Revelation chapter 11, it mentions the temple being measured. Now, the early date people say, aha, if the temple is being measured, that means the temple must have still existed. But they're using things again in a literal fashion. The very same thing is brought out in Ezekiel chapter 40, in verse 1. When Ezekiel wrote, what was the condition of the temple? Oh, this is going to be a real strain. Ezekiel was alive after the temple had been destroyed. And so he wrote about the temple and measuring it in Ezekiel chapter 40, but the temple was already a goner. So, just because the temple is measured in the symbolic language in the book of Revelation does not mean that the physical temple of the Jews still had to be standing. So that's the way these things go. Yes. Thank you. Yes, God has a standard for his church. That's the symbol. Thank you. All right, that's about enough of the weeding through a bunch of that material. And though we going by it lickety-split, it took a long time to even look at that and get it up for you. Now, there's one other thing. Everybody goes bananas over 666. I think I've told you there was a highway that Mary Jo and I used to travel with the kids, numeral 666. And some of you have seen 666 as well. The highway sign kept disappearing. And they changed the number of the highway because people are so obsessed with 666. All right, that's in the book of Revelation. About 13, 18. Someone has come up with a theory, 666. If you put numerals in place of you put alphabetic letters in place of the numerals, you can come up with Nero. Now, I looked at that. The letter value method used to interpret 666 as Nero was devised in 1830 AD by 4 German scholars. The name Nero alone will not provide the number 666 with that plan. So they speculated by using Hebrew letter values and omitting certain vowels, and applied the Latin to it. Then you could come up with Nero Caesar, but you have to translate it next into Greek. So that's confusing, isn't it? This to ever get to it. By using that same plan, then, you could come up with Caligula, Vespasian, Domitian, Adolf Hitler, and other notorious characters. So that's a real puny argument. Now, the real one we'll get stuck on, and I'll have to get off this, is in Revelation chapter 17, because of the expression about the kings. There are 5 who had been, and then one is, and another come for a short time, and then another. And when we get over there, I'm just going to go by it for the time being. And we need to get back into the book today. I'll make copies of that some year. Won't do that today. So they're trying to figure out what king was in power by taking that expression literally. I think that's about it for the time being. I told the preacher that I'm going to stick my neck out today. I'm going to get in trouble. But here it is. Although much of the language used in the book of Revelation sounds very similar to Matthew chapter 24, pertaining to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, certain conditions in the book of Revelation do not match what happened in that city. And due to several statements of early Christians, Irenaeus, Eusebius, Victorinus, I already mentioned some of those, regarding the date of the book of Revelation, and an internal allusion to an apparent king rising from the death of a notorious ruler, the Nero revived myth, and the apparent age of churches in Asia and their decline, plus the 8 kings sequence linked in Revelation 17, in my opinion, the combined internal and external evidence tips the scales slightly in favor of about 95 AD as the date for the writing of the book of Revelation. And many commentaries go that way. So, enough of the tedium. Any observations before we go on? What time is it? Okay. Willie, you're my hander-outer man. Did I give you these? Don't think so. We're going to wear out that copy machine, and some of this might seem of little note right now, but we're going to get into things that need to be understood. You'll need a magnifier glass, and I've got copies here for folks who have declining eyesight that's got bigger font. But I wanted to deliberately put all of that on one page in order to show a parallel in the book of Revelation between the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls of wrath. And when you put the whole sequence of those side by side, you'll begin to see things here and there and at the next one that are the same thing being addressed. And that's the reason a lot of the scholars will see there's a progression in the intensity, gets stronger and stronger, and it pertains to the same kind of thing occurring in each one as we go across the chart. You'll see when you get that chart in your hand. You running out, Willie? Okay. Please come up here, Willie. I got something special for you. Hand these to Sister Barbara, will you? And tell her to put them like that. It's a much bigger font, and maybe it'll be helpful. Yes. Oh, okay, that's a good point.
How would it encourage me if I'd already been through it?
Yes, well, okay, so that does then, for the people who are the 70 AD, prior to 70 AD view of the book, then they would say these things would be coming down afterwards, and the persecutions that would be coming after 70 AD, or at 70 AD, actually. And so it's prophetic in that sense. But the 96ers, 95 for the dating, see these things coming even yet. Now, on the chart I handed out with rows of pictures of some of those emperors, if you look at the persecutions, I believe that chart has more. There's a third page that I did not print. The persecutions came on really hard after Domitian. So then the book of Revelation is prophetic. Okay, that helped? That was not a dumb question. It's a very good question. Thank you. Now, I hope you have an ability to scan through the parallel columns. Mark, I did not put a chart of parallel columns of those seals, trumpets, and bowls in your graphic, did I? Maybe I did. Parallel is probably the key word. If you find that, I don't think it's going to be visible up here on the display, but you have in hand on the graphic that was handed out about the same kind of a thing. So you just please go across real quick and you'll see as you go down through it, things getting heavier and heavier. Well, I'm going to go clear down to the fourth one. I don't want to get down too tedious again on this one. We need to get in the book itself. If you look at the things that happen on the fourth and go clear across and what is affected. Look at the fifth one. You see this open pit, smoke coming out, darkening of the sun. And then on the last, on the bowls, the throne smitten, kingdom darkens. But the point we're about to lose with all this detail is this. God sees what's happening. Evil people are not going to get away with it. As we have seen in the books of the Old Testament, a nation rises, and God sees they're going rotten in their morals and their behavior, and you put up with it so long, and then wham, there's a judgment comes down on them. In the old era, you see it especially with God being very graphic when the prophets wrote one after the other. And even in more modern history, after a while, some things happen. People are not going to put up with it. And nations come in that are even sometimes seem like they're more wicked, and they stomp on people, and there's a whole starting over again. Well, need to go forward now with our readings. Let's get a run at it then. We're out of time. In chapter 6, the opening of the seal, we saw the red horse coming forth, and there was, in verse 4 of chapter 6, peace was taken from the earth. And there was slaying of people. And there was given to him a great sword. We need to look at verse 2. I didn't connect that. It needs to be on there. The one who came out was on a white horse. We talked about that last time. But he had a bow. So the white horse at times will make us think this was the white horseman that we find later in the book, which is Jesus. But he had not a bow, but a sword. So this differs. And because of that, a lot of people do not take this, number one, as the action of Jesus and the gospel on the earth. Those who think the book was written prior to 70 AD probably do put this as Jesus. And they think that all the things that fell out afterward were as a result of the gospel going forth. And so all those terrible things happening on the earth were judgments later. Then that was the peace taken from the earth. Next. Oh, the door is opened. Okay. We're out of time. And I mentioned something had to be got out of the crawl today, and it had to do with the dates. I hope you're able to tolerate that. I don't intend for us to stay put on that all the way through this book. But you need to be aware of it as we go through. So I want to get back into the text and start rolling forward because the end of this class is coming up.